Hello, everybody, and welcome over here at That's Comical. I am Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome, and it is time for another recap of the month that was. And of course, when it always comes to a recap here on That's Comical, I always have to have Dan with me. So, Dan, it's good to have you back for another comic book discussion. I hope that you are ready.
Great to be back again, Steve.
Of course. And because of the fact that we have a very specific topic that is going to go throughout the entire show, there's only one person that had to join us for this conversation because the topic, of course, is horror. And that, of course, is our That's Comical resident scream queen. Cammie is here. Cammie, great to have you on the show today.
Good to be here, and you know this is my favorite topic, so I cannot wait to get started.
Of course. And of course, to every single one of you, first of all, if you are watching and it happens to be a Wednesday, so happy new comic book day, one and all, but please leave this video a like as well as a comment, especially if you're a horror fan. I know that we all want to talk to you, especially Cammie. She could probably talk to you for hours about the topic. But of course, That's Comical is going to start really cranking out some content, everybody. Everybody on the team is going to be contributing very, very soon. So please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you are up to date on all of our latest content. So we're going to be talking about horror in comic books today because of the fact that this is something that is really exploding in the world of comic books, in more so in certain companies than others that are still at least trying to make an effort. But what's so interesting about horror is there's such a history about this specific genre in comic books, because a little history for everybody out there. The horror theme and the pulp comic theme in comic books started emerging in the late 1940s to the mid-1950s. This was after World War II. The comic book industry had already started making its mark with some of the earlier stories of superheroes like Superman and Batman and the Submariner, and we also got introduced to the Justice Society with some of the most classic Golden Age superheroes. But literally, as soon as it got hot, it got ice cold. And people were not picking up those comic books as often as they used to because they were just tuckered out from all the superheroes. So all the companies were saying, well, let's give them something to chew on. So they started doing the horror comics and the noir comics that featured a lot of grotesque images and a lot of sex and a lot of violence, to the point where the parents got a little upset and said, okay, this is not good for children. We cannot let this happen. And that, of course, led to the Comics Authority Code, the infamous Comic Code. And after that, you know, the superheroes came back in the late 1950s, early 1960s because of the Silver Age of comic books, and the rest was history. But horror really did not seem to be a predominant thing in comic books for many, many years. Now, I would probably think that it really started to come back little by little in the 1980s, thanks to comics going back to their dark roots, thanks to creators like Frank Miller and Alan Moore, just to name a few. But I would probably think like it's definitely less than 5 years. We are seeing a massive influx of horror themes and horror titles. So let me start off with asking the person who knows about the now in comics alongside me, Daniel, and then we'll go to Cammie. Why do you think this is happening all of a sudden?
Well, I know it's definitely happening from the indie side. I think the indie comics needed a way to compete with the big two, Marvel and DC, and they found a niche, and it was horror, and then horror caught on, so they stuck primarily to coming out with a lot of releases geared towards horror. Whereas the big two, they obviously had superheroes who were big names, so they stuck to their thing with the superheroes.
Right.
So is their way, the independent companies, of trying to create a niche.
Now, to go over to Cammie, who not only absorbs horror in her comic books, but she loves her novels, she loves her TV shows, her movies. Now, I don't know if you will agree with me in regards to this, Cammie, but I think that horror movies, especially in the last couple of years, have started to say, well, we don't want to be looked at as those B-rated grindhouse films of the 1970s. We want to really give horror a brain, and we want people to really be interested and see something more deep than just the jump scares. So do you think that in regards to the ways that people can absorb the horror quickly, don't get me wrong, horror novels have been smart, deep reads for many a decade, and your idol Stephen King is one of the reasons as to why. But do you think it's because of the fact that all of these horror-themed pieces of medium that are coming out like in the last couple of years in a much more interesting and deeper manner, do you think that this is one of the main reasons why horror is so big right now?
I think that for horror, it is really the indie novels that kind of helped this indie film industry. Because with the indie novels, I think people started to discover that there are so many subgenres of horror. A conversation that I have quite a lot with many people from many demographics is that they are constantly in comparison of horror movies and horror books, thinking that they're one and the same. And I continuously, and even Stephen King, the man of the hour, he has a quote that says, comparing movies and books is like oranges to apples. They're both fruits, but they have different tastes. And that cannot be any better said. So what I always try to get people to understand is that because of these subgenres, it's very important to pull these out in movies also. So absolutely, I think that what film directors and producers and writers are trying to give the audience is that understanding and the notion that there is more to horror than just slashers. And
Right.
so many people tell me time and time again, they don't go see horror movies because they don't want to be grossed out or they don't like the jump scares, as you mentioned. And I constantly tell people there is so much more depth to horror. And it really does depend on your director.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, I'm not the biggest horror fan, but you, Cammie, know that I have done my very best to make sure that I at least see those truly iconic horror films. I will say right now that my favorite novel of all time is a horror novel, and it's Stephen King's It, and I loved the two films as well. But one of the few things that I will say is that the very first time I truly, truly loved a horror film, and I don't even know if you would classify it as a horror, Cammie, but James Wan's 2004 Marvel that is Saw. That was one of the most amazing films that I ever watched because it's not just about the horror and the images that are very, very scary and grotesque, but you had to really watch it or you were going to miss something absolutely crucial. Like, he really wanted it to be a thinking man's film, and that's one of the main reasons why I loved that film so much.
Keep in mind with horror, and I'm glad that you mentioned that film because I like how people connect with films in different ways. And I think what you just said is so important when it comes to the discussion of horror films. Horror comes in many facets. A lot of people assume that it's just a fear of a certain thing, like maybe spiders or snakes or ghosts or clowns. Horror is what it means to you. It is a definition that is personalized. So what scares me might not necessarily scare you. What is deep rooted and deep vested in people's minds, in their memories, in their past, are the things that jar you. And so I always tell people you need to connect to your horror in a way that it is meaningful for you, or you're not going to get anything out of it. So I continuously tell people, if that movie isn't for you, just like a novel, put it aside, turn it off, don't watch it. It's not for you, and that's fine. That doesn't make it a bad movie. That doesn't make it ill written. That doesn't make it, poorly directed. It's just not your piece of pie. Moving on to something that you do like, though, you will find those movies that you're deeply vested with, that you connect with, because you find something that is just truly eerie and horrific, that gives you those bone, like, dense chills, that gives you that upset stomach. Those are the reactions that I look for now when I watch horror. Of course, growing up with horror, because I started horror very young. People look at my mom like there was something wrong with her, but I tell people constantly, she tried to stop me. I was 4 years old when I watched my first horror film, and my mom said, you are way too young for this. And I'm like, but Mom, Freddy Krueger is one cool dude. Only to come to find out he's a creepy ass pedophile, but you know, it's just one of those things you learn when you're older. But I think it's so important to mentally, physically connect with your horror, and the same can be said for a comic. You know, if you find that series, if you find that anthology that you connect with, you can sing praises, and it really does start to bring people into reading what you like and sharing the joys of your everyday with people, because there's nothing more exciting than talking to someone who doesn't necessarily have to be well versed in everything. Like, I've never read every horror comic that's available, but I can tell you a gambit of them and share with you my favorites, which will at least, you know, maybe get your interest into possibly reading something that I've read, or, you know, in the adverse watching something that I've watched.
Steve, I'm going to add that popular culture and streaming and the Marvel Cinematic Universe created the horror vacuum.
I would definitely agree. As a matter of fact, I just watched a horror movie over the weekend. Besides going to see Black Widow, I actually watched the first of the brand new Netflix Fear Street trilogy. So as a Goosebumps reader, of course, I was excited to see something from R.L. Stine. I was impressed with the first film. Let's just say it got me to want to watch the second one, which I am planning to hopefully this weekend, and I will probably watch the third one as well. But let's talk a little bit about some of those people that at least attempted to try and get horror into popularity again in comic books. And we're just going to go through a couple of titles because, Dan, you said it. You hit the nail right on the head. It's the indie companies that are really driving it right now. A brand new comic series that is starting was very well hyped, and that, of course, is the one of 5 issues of the Skybound 10-year anniversary. There's a ongoing story that's going to be through all 5 issues, which is about Rick Grimes from The Walking Dead. So, of course, it's being written by who is now known as the Child of Image, who is Robert Kirkman. And, of course, he was the one that basically made zombie comics cool, because the funny thing is, when he was trying to pitch The Walking Dead to Jim Valentino, he was saying, you know, oh, I want the zombie comics. And he was like, no, no one's going to buy a zombie comic. And then he goes, oh, well, I didn't tell you. This whole thing about the zombie apocalypse is being created by a group of aliens that want to take over the world. And he says, I'm going to drop all these Easter eggs throughout my first issue, so you're going to see it when the story comes full circle. So they were like, oh, that's interesting. That's never been done before. Let me read these issues. And they were like, where are all these Easter eggs? He goes, there are no Easter eggs. I just told you that because you wanted a hook so you could just give me the rights to publish the book. However, in this story, Rick Grimes 2000, the alien invasion is happening. So he's actually bringing his hook to the Walking Dead story. And I just found that so cool and funny. Like, I'm like, wow, you really are going to do that after all this time, after The Walking Dead became the phenomenon that it is. Bravo, Robert Kirkman. This is why he is such a beloved writer in the world of comics, particularly in the indies. And of course, when it comes to this year alone, one of the most talked about comic book series was an indie, and Daniel is really playing a game of catch up. Like, I've never seen someone buy so many variants of one comic, and of course, it's Tony Fleeks' Stray Dogs. I love how they're doing all of these movie poster parody covers. This, of course, is Friday the 13th. This is issue number 5. I loved the story. It was such an interesting take on a simple story that looked like a Disney movie gone wrong in all the right ways. And there's very little dialogue, but the visuals and the artwork just drives the story. And I personally loved this story from beginning to end. And again, not a big horror fan, but this is the story of a bunch of dogs that are living together in a mysterious house. And what they don't know is the person who keeps getting all these dogs together is a serial killer. That's just a cool story.
Steve, you keep saying you're not a horror fan, but I encourage people not to use that phrase, because everybody is a horror fan. There is something in this world that scares you. There is something in this world that jars you. There is something in this world that you find creepy or eerie or keeps you up at night, or something that you avoid because you don't want the memories of the nightmares. So I tell people to avoid that at all costs because of the fact that there are so many subgenres of horror. You are a horror fan. You might not it might not be necessarily your go-to. You might not, go to a comic book store and be like, oh, give me all your horror like I do. But you definitely love horror in a different way. And everybody has, something that they go to or they go back to. And as many times as you've read horror this year and enjoyed it, you are a horror fan, just maybe not to the same level that I am.
I would definitely agree with you, because even if the stories that I'm reading, particularly in the indie titles, are not horror, there are a lot of horror elements that are being featured a lot in these indies, like Jeff Johns' Geiger. There's a lot of horror images. I mean, this character, when he glows, he looks like a skeleton. And then there's Scott Snyder's Nocterra, which is very much horror element filled, even though it's really more of a science fiction story. So the fact that these two specific writers are still incorporating the horror elements, that's pretty cool. And I mean, another big name, he's even writing for the mainstream, but he's really showing his chops in the indie market. It's James Tynion. I mean, look, The Nice House on the Lake, the new DC Black Label. The Department of Truth, which is a fantastic book. The big announcement that the both of you are reading a comic that I'm not reading. I am not reading Something is Killing the Children. But just yesterday, they announced the creative team for the new television show. And it is the creative team that directed Dr. Sleep. So that's a big drop right there. And again, these titles that I just mentioned, they are definitely horror-driven. I think Department of Truth has a little bit more of a noir feel to it, though, but there's definitely more horror elements in it. And, of course, there is one guy that, whenever you hear his name, you just go out and get his stuff because everything that he writes is gold, and that's Chip Zdarsky. He's writing Stillwater. He's writing The Silver Coin with a whole bunch of other people. He's even bringing some of the horror elements to some of the big name heroes in the big two, which is more awesome. But, Cammie, I want to just derive a little bit more on what you just said. You're right. I may be a horror fan in a completely different way because one of my all-time favorite comic book characters wraps the superhero elements and the gothic/horror theme elements in one perfect package. And it's Todd McFarlane's Spawn. Spawn has always had the gothic and religious and horror images throughout his books all the way through his run. And it's been over 320 issues right now, and it's still got a major cult following, and people still absolutely love his work. So you're right, Cammie. You may not be someone that goes to see all of these horror movies. You may not be the person that sits down and reads a horror novel, but it seems to me that horror is just seeming to seep into everything that a lot of us are enjoying these days.
Well, and I think a lot of it does come from that when you give in to your own desires, I guess. I don't know if that's necessarily the right word. When it comes to horror, it fits very well for me because I do have a desire to, lock into all this inner darkness that I carry. But I think for a lot of people, they're kind of afraid to make that connection because they're afraid it kind of says something about them or their lifestyle or something that they may have awakened within them. But I think the beauty of horror is it not only helps to release those inner thoughts and desires and things of that nature, but it also humanizes you in a different way. I think that we often forget that the world that we live in is very dark. There is a lot of really crazy things that happens around us. And so I appreciate when a writer or a director, producer goes in and they're honest. There's nothing more honest in writing than horror because we all live it, we experience it, we've seen it. And I think that sometimes it can be a little bit jarring for people to be exposed to something that maybe they didn't know existed. But if people really truly open their eyes and read something other than their norm, they would realize that there is a lot of really grotesque things that happen. And so to normalize these things and to bring it to the forefront. But then in comics, you're adding a different element. You're adding maybe like a sci-fi twist on it, or you're adding, you know, some kind of different twist to kind of make it maybe more palatable for the average person. But there's a lot for people to kind of understand what is going on around them. And it does humanize horror in a way that it just becomes part of your everyday. It doesn't become that taboo. And I think that's kind of what happened in the 1950s when you had the comic code that was put on there. I mean, we can see that when it comes to talking about horror in video games or violence in video games that happened in the 90s, and it kind of carried out throughout. You know, people are always trying to put a label on something. They're always trying to say, this is the reason why. This is why things have gone wrong or gone sour. But I think oftentimes if we bring the horrors to the forefront, we identify them, we understand them, we realize that it's not that thing that's causing this awful transpiring within society. It's just society is coming to fruition. It's blossoming to a point where you're just paying attention to it. Now you know what's going on. And so I enjoy reading indie comics. I enjoy reading indie horror because it continuously reminds me of the real in this world, but with a twist. You know, there's always a twist. And so I'll always have my specific subgenres that I go to.
Now, Daniel, in regards to the big two, DC and Marvel, I don't necessarily think that they're not at least trying to put some horror elements into their books. I mean, you take a look at artists, you take a look at creators like Donny Cates, as well as Al Ewing, in regards to some of the books that they've been writing in recent days, like Venom and the Hulk. But do you think the reason why they're not trying to be as in your face in regards to horror elements as opposed to the indie companies is just because of the fact that there's more of a corporate mindset in these two specific companies, and they just feel that if they go in those directions, they're going to get, like, you know, the finger waved at them saying, oh no, you shouldn't be doing that, you're corrupting the children, or anything, something like that. I just love the fact that that's what's going on in a corporate mindset. Meanwhile, one of the most popular titles in comic books right now is called Something is Killing the Children.
They don't have to do that because they sell comic books without doing that stuff. So it's not really necessary for them to hook on to that genre, even though they're trying with, you know, I know Null and King in Black was somewhat of a horror, and DC Black Label does horror stuff, but they don't have to solely focus on that because they can sell books without getting into that genre.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the more recent books that's currently being written right now, again by Chip Zdarsky, who everybody these days is talking about Chip Zdarsky, and no one has anything negative to say about this guy. I'm so glad, because you're a big Daredevil reader, you enjoy his work, and I've been reading a whole bunch of his other titles. They're great, but Spider-Man Spider Shadow is a very well done book, and it's the classic Spider-Man and the whole thing, like it's an alternate, it's a what-if story, and right now, what if is a big thing floating around in popular culture these days because that new animated series is about to drop on Disney+. It's about alternate universes. What if Peter Parker became Venom and not Eddie Brock, the character that we all knew became Venom in Amazing Spider-Man 298. And what's so interesting about this is there's so much horror elements found in this book, from Peter Parker just going completely out of his mind, like in Jack Nicholson's portrayal in The Shining, and he's basically just doing things that you never would imagine a superhero, a beloved superhero, to do in just about every page of this book. And I mean, when you take a look at horror elements in comic books, especially when it comes to popular characters, I don't know about you guys, but Batman's always had them. He's always had those atmospheres, but I really think that it was Scott Snyder that brought it out into the forefront in the early 2000s. It's so funny because I was watching the Comics Aficionados podcast over at Thinking Critical, which is something everybody should be watching. I just threw out a link to it on Twitter yesterday over on our Twitter, and they were talking about, you know, the New 52. When people are asked what's the best Batman story ever told, they always go to The Court of Owls. Look at this cover. Look at this dark, grotesque thing on this comic book. Scott Snyder took the horror elements and brought them to the forefront. I mean, Death of the Family. This is one of the most disturbing versions of the Joker you will ever read in comics. A Joker that ripped his face off and stapled it back onto his face. That's just creepy. And some of the images in those books made my stomach turn. And the fact that people would say that that's pushing the bar or that's not something that should be read. But again, another thing that I keep trying to tell people is that when was the last time comic books were truly made for children? I don't see children in comic book stores anymore. I see adults. I see grown men and women going into comic book stores and buying books for themselves to read, because all of that stuff that they're craving is in the pages of these comics.
I would go as far as to say I don't think comics have ever been written for children. I think children gravitated to them because of the fact that they were colorful and they were easier to read, they were more accessible, but I don't think comics were ever really intended for children. And I think that as we have gotten more developed into the comic world, in terms of generations, you have the children that used to read the comics that are now creating the comics, and so they've gotten darker, they've gotten grittier. But in terms of Batman, I think that's why I always gravitated to Batman, is because Gotham City is so gritty and dark, and I mean, you feel the moisture in the air, you know, it's gross, and the entire city revolves around Arkham Asylum, where you have a bunch of nutcases who are all psychopaths. How is that not horror, you know? And I think, again, this is kind of what happens in popular culture, is that we sometimes just kind of brush over things that are really dark and intended to be dark and try to kind of butter them up and fluff them out, if you will. But there are some things that you just can't hide, and Gotham City is one of those things. It's very gritty, and I think that if we embrace the darkness, my children, and we really enjoy things for their intended design, I think that you would get a lot more out of them. I think that sometimes with popular culture things, it will definitely bring people to the movie theater or to the shelves of bookstores and comic book stores and these things because of conversation. People are talking about it. Oh, it's the latest and greatest. Let me go see what everybody's talking about. But if you actually stop for yourself and enjoy the elements of it, you're going to pull things out that you identify with. And that's how you connect to things. And then you continue to open it up because you're like, well, if I like this, what else is like this? And then you start asking around or doing your own research, and before you know it, you've got a whole arsenal of things that are dark and just sad.
And I think that Daniel, he always brings this interesting topic to the table, but rightfully so, because you kind of have to with all the current conversations in the comic industry. And that's just the fact that the comic book industry is being sought out for television shows and movies and other types of medium. And I think that there's a big MCU film that's coming because they've been talking about this ever since it was greenlit. And that's Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Like, they're saying we are really going to be bringing the horror to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And also, Cammy, you will appreciate this. When you got Sam Raimi, even though he made the Spider-Man films, you go back to Evil Dead. And as someone who just watched Evil Dead in the last 5 years, that was some effed up, you know what, right there. I could not believe some of the imagery in that film. So the fact that we got a horror fan, an iconic name in horror, that's going to be directing this brand new Doctor Strange film, if they're really, really serious about the horror coming to the MCU, I think that that's just going to open the floodgates for the big two to say, maybe it's time we let the horror run wild in our books. I mean, look, Marvel Zombies seems to be a big seller in comic books right now. And in the world of DC, I know that it sort of felt a little anticlimactic, but people did like Dark Knight's death metal or Dark Knight's metal, both of them. There were a lot of horror elements in The Batman Who Laughs, but I don't know. Do you think that that's what's going to happen, Dan?
All these companies have their pulse on popular culture, and their number one objective is to make money. So they're going to go with whatever's popular and whatever they think is going to make money. So just like Batman changes with the times, like 1960s, the TV show was very campy. And now the Batman movies recently were more, I would say, more geared towards the horror genre without actually calling it horror. So that's what these companies will do. They'll change with the times.
The only thing that I have heard through the grapevine is based on the vision that Sam Raimi wants to go. It was also one of the main reasons why the original director, who actually directed the first Doctor Strange, left the project, because he felt that he was being tied down by Kevin Feige, because it seemed that he wanted this Marvel film to be rated R, because he really wanted to push the bar and go a little bit further with the horror elements. But Kevin Feige was like saying, no, don't do that, because we want everybody to come and see this movie. The same could be said about why Zack Snyder's theatrical version of Batman v Superman was such a disaster, because he was forced to tone it down. But I don't think that that's something that needs to happen or should happen these days, because regardless of the rating of a film, people are going to bring their kids to see that movie anyway. I've said this before. I saw 6-year-olds in my theater when me and my wife went to see Deadpool. And that's not even a horror film. It's a rated R film. But there's a comic book character in there, so the kids can come see it. So I don't really think there needs to be an effort to tie things down, because depending on how you are as a parent is going to determine whether your kid sees that movie at a younger age or at an older age or not.
Well, you have to, Steve, they're selling a brand. So the brand is geared toward all audiences, not just adults.
I agree.
That's the thinking. I
And
think
not only
behind
that, kids also will take from a movie what is identifiable to them. You know, like for me, watching Freddy Krueger at, you know, a very young age, I didn't realize all of the elements of the film. I didn't really understand fully what was going on. I was just captivated by this guy with fingers for knives, or knives fingers for knives. But the thing is that, you know, parents are going to take their kids to things because it's convenient for them, because they can't find a sitter, or it's just the time of day, or they want to make it a family outing. And I remember going to R-rated films with my parents when I was young, and if my parents didn't want me to see something, they would put their fingers over my eyes, you know? So this can still happen. You might, you know, look through the little cracks or whatever and still see some things that you're not supposed to, but it's not going to jar kids forever. Kids are so exposed to any type of media now that kids are seeing things well beyond their age range, and have for years, because things are so accessible now. Whether they borrow their parents' phone or take it out of their purse, or, you know, they're on their iPads or their computers or whatever the case may be. And you can bet your bottom that parents are not putting these restrictions on their devices. There's very few parents that set limits. So this has been happening for generations. It doesn't change them. If anything, I encourage parents to expose their children to these things at an earlier age, because it normalizes it. The more you hide your children and shelter them from seeing things that in reality exist, you're kind of doing them a disservice, because then they're going to end up being 18, 19 years old, seeing this for the first time and being like, oh my God, when did this start happening? It's been happening your whole life, kid, you know? So I encourage parents to let their kids explore things, Kids are going to let you know if they like it or not. My nephew is 7 and absolutely loves Michael Myers. Should he be watching it? No. But again, my mom realizes he is just like me and she can't stop him. She lets him watch it, but he doesn't pull out the same things from it that I do. So just let your kids gravitate to what they love. Of course, parent how you're going to parent. I'm not telling parents how to parent out there, but once a child is exposed to it, they're going to be like, okay, I've seen it, moving on to, Paw Patrol, and they'll go about their day.
Dan, were you part of the group that went to go see Bordello of Blood with me? Theaters?
I believe so.
Okay, because that was the first movie I snuck into. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. But before we go, I just wanted to know, Dan, is there any title that you want to recommend in the world of horror right now that everybody should be reading? And then we'll go to Cammie and then we'll wrap it up.
Hands down, Something is Killing the Children.
Cammie?
Honestly, that is my title, but I had a feeling Daniel was going to say that. So I'm
That's
actually going to
fine.
mimic one that you had mentioned in the beginning, and that is The Nice House on the Lake. This is definitely a secondary for me. I'm really enjoying this series right now.
So thank you so much for joining me for the recap of June 2021. We'll definitely be excited for the next one, and we hope that you will all join us then. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you then, everybody.